I'd like to introduce Doug Ammons. He grew up in Missoula. He went to Hellgate High School and then to the University of Montana, where he graduated with high honors in mathematics, physics, and psychology. He then went on to receive a master's degree and PhD in experimental psychology. That's kind of scary to think that he's on here with this group, right? He also pursued many interests such as geology and history. He was an expedition whitewater kayaker for 30 years. He traveled all over the world doing first descents of the hardest rivers in the Himalayas, Andes, Alaska, northern Canada, and the jungles of Mexico. And he made 8 films from National Geographic, ESPN, and Outdoor Life Network, and published 2 books of his adventures. He had turned his adventure storytelling toward recreating the dramatic historical events of the Western U.S. and Montana's colorful history in particular. His recent book, A Darkness Lit by Heroes, is about the spectacular mine disaster of 1917 and was published last year in conjunction with the event's 100th anniversary. In October 2018, he received the High Plains Book Award for Creative Nonfiction. He's also working on several other books, including one on an Irish immigrant at the Center for the Struggle for Freedom of Speech during World War I. I met Doug through his daughter, Sandy, who's a trainer at the Women's Club, and then she told me about his book and read the book, and here he is. At the end, I'm sure if you're interested in his book or other information, you can email him. He can give us his email at the end. So go ahead, Doug. Thanks for being here.
Okay. Well, thank you very much for having me. It's a tremendous story that I just happened across. It was nothing that I had planned. My wife and I were working on one other book and actually a couple of offshoots. And in the middle of writing one chapter that had to do with this disaster, which is the biggest hard rock mining disaster in U.S. history, I have this document that had called the Coroner's Inquest that had 600 pages of eyewitness testimony drop in my lap because the archivist knew that I was looking for this stuff. And they
Doug, excuse me, I think you've got to get a little bit closer to your microphone. I'm not sure what's going on, but.
How's this?
That's better.
Okay. In any case, I was not planning to write this story, but I had this treasure trove of eyewitness testimony fall in my lap. And it presented this problem for me because it was this incredibly difficult, complex story. But yet I realized that I had the last living people who ever worked underground in Butte who were willing to work with me to try to understand the document and figure out the maps and so forth. So I knew that this was the only chance that anybody would probably ever have to tell this story in detail on a personal basis. And so I pretty much dropped everything and tried to understand the story. So here's, I think, probably one of the most powerful emotional stories that I've ever come across. And so I'll just give you a quick run through it. So A Darkness Lit by Heroes is the name. And what happens is probably the craziest place that's ever existed is the turn of the century Butte, Montana, around 1900. It just was the wildest, craziest, richest, freest place that you could ever imagine and beyond that. And so this story really starts in what created Butte? Why was it so special? And in order to tell the story, we have to actually recreate to some degree this underground world that no longer exists. And so let's start at the very beginning. You go up to the top of the Butte Hill and you look out to the east from the memorial site, you'll see the Granite Mountain head frame. It was part of what was called the Speculator Mine. They were both the same things. They just had several different shafts. So it's mostly buried by rock from the Berkeley pit. But this is what you see if you look out from the memorial. And on a night in June 8th, 1917, there was a night shift here with about 400 or 500 guys underground. And the fire started unexpectedly right in the shaft, and all hell broke loose. It was a total normal night shift, and and everybody was suddenly pushed into an absolute emergency without any preparation whatsoever. If we look at this mine, what I'm going to do is, if you, I want you to see what the mine looked like, at least this half of it, if you take away the 80 or 90 feet of rock and you turn back the clock 100 years. So watch as this slide changes, and you start to see what's underneath all that rock and all those years. It was the biggest mine in the world. So we can reverse that 100 years and go down into that mine now, because underneath all that rock and all those years, what lies there is the biggest mine in the world in 1917. It had 1,200 men working there every day. It was the most successful copper mine ever known, and it was about to be known as the biggest hard rock mining disaster in U.S. history. How did it get to this point? You have to go back even a couple decades further to be able to see. So Butte, you've probably heard all various stories of the gold mining rush in Montana, and Butte was a part of that. After the frenzy of the California gold rush, men searched the entire western United States for the next big strike, and they found strikes all over the place. And you've heard of Bannock, Virginia City, Last Chance Gulch. So thousands of prospectors fanned out all across Montana territory, and some of them found the Summit Valley, which is where Butte now sits. They panned for gold. They ran their rocker boxes in the gravels and the sands of Silverbow Creek. But the problem is that Butte was not a rich gold mine. It had very diffuse gold dust, and so the gold ran out really quickly. And then they went up in the gulches and used hydraulic mining with laboriously dug ditches all across these gigantic granite reefs for miles from the upper parts of the drainages around up Silverbow Creek. And so they ran all these things, but most of their energy went into barren piles of rock. The lore has it that up on the hill there, early travelers came across a ditch or a little trench dug and then chipped into a quartz vein. And beside it was a worn, chipped, broken antler. What happened was some unknown man had tried to dig into the quartz with the antler, probably trying to pry the beautiful golden crystals out of it, iron pyrite, fool's gold. Okay, what he didn't realize, and what those travelers didn't realize, was that below them, for thousands and thousands of feet, were mineral veins running down more than a mile and hiding more riches than anybody could ever possibly imagine. Now, instead of gold, what you're looking at are complex copper sulfides. They look like this. The granite batholith that came up underneath and forms the entire Continental Divide area there from Helena down to Butte had underneath it this giant reservoir of molten quartz mixed with all kinds of metals. And so when that batholith came up, surface pushed, and then it started cooling, huge cracks appeared, and that molten reservoir got shoved and pressurized just right up into the cracks. And then it cooled. And what happened then were the mineral veins of these kinds of minerals formed all through there. And they're complex copper sulfides. They've included, of course, gold and silver, but also lead and zinc, molybdenum, and also the richest copper deposit that had ever been found in the world. So these aren't gold nuggets. They're complex copper sulfides. They have names like energite, chalcopyrite, bornite. Okay, but the miners called them peacock copper. And when they blew a blast in a big, rich vein, all the rock glittered with every color of the rainbow in the candles that they were holding up. Peacock copper. The problem was that the panning gold is one thing. You can have a burrow with a pick and a gold pan, and maybe make your rocker boxes with an axe and some boards that you brought along. But to get in the deep rock, hard rock mining, you have to have industry, and that's right in the middle of the Montana wilderness. So you need things, like thousands of feet of steel cable and iron and steel ore cars, hoisting. You need thick steel beams and smokestacks, giant air compressors, and you need crushing mills and blast furnaces and roasters, and enough to make a giant smelter. Okay? And you also need, as things develop, there were hundreds and hundreds of mines going hundreds and hundreds of feet into hard rock below them. By the 1870s, there were more than 150 mines. They only went a couple hundred feet down. And what they were doing mostly was mining silver for coinage, but also some copper, because there was so much copper. It was a nuisance at first, but then they realized, of course, the telegraph lines, the very beginnings of electric use, that they had literally the copper gold mine, as it were, for the beginnings of a new world. If you recall, the first telegraph lines across the Atlantic Ocean were in the mid-1860s. So you're right in that area where things are starting to accelerate. A mere 2 or 3 years later, after this 1875, 1876 era, Edison invented the light bulb, Bell invented the telephone, and some men saw the future. Okay, we all know the copper kings of Montana, Marcus Daly, William Clark, and F. Augustus Heinze. They were 3 of the richest men in the world. Okay, and they all lived in Butte, along with dozens and dozens of other millionaires and multimillionaires. There's never been a concentration of wealth like it, and it all came from the mining and the banking and the related activities there. Unbelievable place out in the middle of the Montana wilderness. Okay, these guys made their giant fortunes from copper. And I don't like, I guess as a scientist, it might seem strange that I don't really like numbers, because I don't think that they really tell us that much. But I'll say a few. Is that in the period from the 1880s and 1890s, the US by itself used 60% of all the copper in the world, and Butte produced pretty much about half that. Okay, that copper was gobbled up into a tidal wave of new electrical inventions. It was used in the wiring and the lights and the telephone systems, running factories, trolleys, motors, everything electrical. It was simply a tidal wave of a new world. And if you think about it, you realize the extent of that. In every building prior to 1975 and a little after, every single electrical invention, every bit of the wiring or most of it, came from Butte. So if you're living in a house that's older than about 1975, I'm living in one from about 1920, Butte surrounds you. Butte is being used to take this presentation and send it across to you. Butte is really in everything all around us, even still, even though it hasn't been actively mined there in the same way for many years. It still is the continental pit, and it still does produce a fair amount of copper, but other sources have been found. So Butte, if you think about it, is surrounding you. It's in the walls. It's what allows you the benefit of the modern civilization. And I would argue that probably more than any other single place, Butte catapulted our country from a rural agrarian society into an industrial world power. It was ground zero for the creation of our modern world. And that's because it was ground zero for copper. Okay, people from everywhere came to Butte. It was flavor. If you got there, you could find a job somehow. The jobs in mining were some of the most lucrative in the world for somebody with no skills whatsoever, but who was willing to learn. Irish came, as everybody knows. Butte's one of the most Irish places outside of Ireland in the world. If you just look at the backgrounds of these people, you understand why they made this change. Okay, in Ireland from the 1840s, 1870s, repeated famines, very, very poor, extremely difficult social circumstances. The Irish were unable to own land. They were able to be evicted by landlords at any time, at any moment, just thrown out of their houses into the muddy street, and they were by the hundreds of thousands. During and after the famines, 1/3 of the Irish population died, 1/3 left the country, and 1/3 stayed there. And so the people that stayed there basically lived in communal workhouses, or a great many of them did. And it was infested with cholera and dysentery. And they were doing simple jobs. They were diggers, they were called, building roads. What were they paid? 8 pennies a day. 8 pennies a day. They had no future in Ireland. So in times like that, with people like that, situations like that, who would not gamble and come to a place like Butte that promised everything? Okay, who would not throw the dice and try for a better life for themselves and their family? So people did come. They came by the tens of millions to the United States and by the tens of thousands to Butte. Men poured into the city from all over the world. And it's not just the Irish. There are at least 40 different ethnic groups there. Basically, every country in Europe is represented, as well as Mexico and Syria, Korea, Lebanon, China, Japan. It's unbelievable the ethnic wealth of that place and the history. And of course, it's this combined thing, so it's all the best and all the worst, right? It's the melting pot in the most astonishing form, right there condensed in the Montana wilderness. These are men seeking a new life. They're willing to take risks. And if you look closely at all this, as the city grew, it went from 6,000 to more than 100,000 in just a little over 2 decades. These were men seeking a new life. And so if you look closely at this group of guys about to go down in a ship in the Speculator in about 1910 or 1908, these are the faces of the men who built our modern world. Okay, you can look closely. There are great stories among them, just this a wonderful richness of humanity. Okay, there's a wonderful story that Pat Williams talked about with his great grandmother. So his young daughter Lizzie's taking off from the docks at Cove Harbor. And so she's being told by her mother, she said, Lizzie, when you get to the New World, don't stop in America. You go straight to Butte, Montana. And I love that because what it says is Butte was its own destiny. It wasn't even really considered to be part of America. It was its own destiny, its own universe. You could buy a ticket from any big city in Europe with cross-Atlantic travel and a train ticket from whatever port you ended up all the way to Butte. One thing here, if you look up here in the picture, you see the candles in the men's pockets. Okay, it's 1908. They're ready to go underground. They have 3 candles for an 8-hour shift. That's their light. Okay, 1906, Heinze, who was the last of the Copper Kings, really sold out to Amalgamated, which became Anaconda. And the whole world changed. What you had was the incoming of a new group, and one of those groups was the North Butte Mining Company, which was not the same as the Anaconda. It was basically realizing, going through all the old documents, all the old evidence there, that the North Butte, basically, North Butte Mining Company had an Apollo project for mining. They were doing everything at the very height of the industry and far more progressive than anybody else. And this is partly what made them so effective. They bought like 25 different claims and they created this giant underground mine, unlike anything that had ever been done. They were decades ahead of the Anaconda Company in doing this. This is a picture of roughly of the underground veins that are scattered across the 25 different claims. And they had this system where they would drive down the shafts in 3 different places. There's another ventilation shaft. And then they were able to connect in this giant underground highway system all the ore from 8 major veins there and bring it right up, in this case, their new shaft, the Granite Mountain Shaft. Okay, and to do that, they had to build the best state-of-the-art, most powerful equipment, the best equipped mine hoist and mine yard in the world, and that was the Granite Mountain. A key to that was this gigantic hoist that was probably about 5 times more powerful than anything that had ever been built for mining. It could lift 30 tons of ore, and the skips and the cables, 30 tons from a dead stop to 40 plus miles an hour in just a couple seconds. The hoist engineer, who's way over here on the left in the hoist house, he's basically 3,000 or 4,000 feet away from all the cable going underground, straight under the head frame, and he could put a loaded skip, or he could put a loaded 4 different cages of men within a ½ inch from 3,500 or 4,000 feet up above on the surface. So, and he could run that 30 or 40 ton skip at 40 miles an hour and put it anywhere he wanted. Never had humans wielded such power with such skill and precision. This is what the North Butte Mining Company was doing. Okay, they were the biggest copper mine in the world. This is 1917. The U.S. enters World War I, and suddenly everybody needs copper. The North Butte Mining Company, after they sunk the Granite Mountain shaft, the Speculator, which is the name of the main claim there, went from the smallest mine on the Butte Hill to the biggest, deepest, best designed, and most productive mine in the world, from 70 men to over 1,200. Okay, from bad air to the best ventilated mine, from a rickety small engine to the best and most powerful thing ever created. So in World War I, suddenly copper was needed, and zinc as well, for brass. And it was said that there was an ounce of Butte copper in every single shot fired by the Allies in World War I. Okay, this is the kind of person that went there. J.D. Moore, he was a shift boss, so he's a jack of all trades. He knew about rock, dynamite, and how men worked. He had to know every single job that was done there. Okay, and he was just as good with his fists as he was with a sledgehammer pick or dynamite. And this is the nature of things, is that it's an authoritarian system, but it's also a meritocracy, right? If you didn't have the respect of your men, they wouldn't work for you. But if you did have it, they would do anything for you, and you likewise. This is the bond of the underground. Loyalty is the core part of that. So this is where more work. It's just one layer, one 200-foot layer, and you can see the little crosshatch things. That's the stopes where they're actively mining the ore. The ore is in like sheets, anywhere from 2 feet wide to 40 or more feet wide, going in this section of the hill roughly vertical. Okay, this is what happens when you hollow out the ore. You have a thing called square set timbering, where you fill out and support the areas where the ore is being taken from. Okay, on June 8th, 1917, they were upping their system. They were upping their game. They wanted the best fire prevention system ever created. But they had to hook in a big set of new electric lines, high voltage lines. And so they were lowering down the shaft here with 1,400-foot cable, and they lowered it down. They got down to the 2,600-foot level where they were going to connect into the big transformer. And what happened was suddenly the cable started slipping. The electricians watched. They jumped out of the way as this 3-ton cable started coming down the shaft, ripping everything out, all the water lines, the brackets, the other lines, the other electrical lines, and started collapsing in, and finally all settled down after tearing the shaft apart at about little under the 2,400-foot level. And so the foreman had to go down to try and get it out so that the mine wouldn't be shut down. Okay, remember that these guys are using candles, and they just started using carbide lanterns. The light in the tunnels underground are all being lit by a flame, an acetylene flame in the case of the carbide, right, 1,000 degrees. And so they went down the shaft to try to pick out the cable, which was all shredded up. The inside of the cable was protected by a lead sheath. And that lead sheath was ripped off, and there was insulation everywhere. The insulation was an oil-soaked fabric. It was the best thing that the Westinghouse, the new Westinghouse company's engineers could come up with for dissipating heat, but it also was extremely flammable. They'd never had a problem with fire. But now they had the shredded internal part of the insulation everywhere in the shaft, and the miners went down to try to pull out the cable with their open flames as they stood on the timbers of the shaft with anywhere from 600 to 1,000 feet of open shaft below them on one side and all the torn up cable on the other. And the inevitable happened. Ernest Solau, the night foreman, his carbide lantern came in contact with the insulation, and suddenly a gigantic fire started all around them. They were right in the midst of the biggest fire hazard ever created. And ironically, it was created by the high tension or the high voltage power cable that came down to make work the fire prevention system, the ultimate state of the art. So this is the ultimate irony of this thing, is the very cable that they needed to make the fire prevention system work was the thing that caused the fire, that and human error. So the fire started, and this is what a mine fire looks like. This is above ground. This is the Alice mine in 1906. But imagine this fire down in the shaft. All that toxic smoke, all is confined to and pressurized into the underground tunnels. So Sellow, who had inadvertently started this fire, that he and the two guys who were with him had to rush up to the top, to the next station above them as the fire completely took over the shaft below them. They had only a few seconds to get up without being incinerated. Okay, and this is the nature of the tunnels here. They're going in every direction. If you remember that gigantic maze that I showed you, and I'll show you some additional ones here. And so instead of being able to lift up the cable's incinerating the shaft at a high temperature. Okay, the only water they had there was a drinking keg, because all the water pipes were broken in the shaft from the fall of the cable. And so there was nothing they could do except to try to escape. Collins took the cage up, who was a ship boss who was working with Sellow, up to the top, and they tried to put on the cages to rescue the men down below. But what happened was that two station tenders, Conroy and Sheridan, went back down, but the fire had grown about 200 feet up the shaft, and they were accidentally slipped right into the top of the fire. There was total pandemonium. Nobody knew what was going on. They were lifted up in a gigantic pillar of flame with both men embracing each other. And suddenly at midnight, or about 12:30 a.m., people in the yard are suddenly confronted with this giant pillar of flame with two of their own embraced in the middle of it. And people realizing, my God, what is going on down there? So the fire swept, and the smoke swept into the tunnels. Okay, this is a nature. If you're looking on the 2,400 foot level, you can see the Granite Mountain shaft in the middle, and then a big crosscut going below it into this really complex maze of tunnels. Now Sellow had to run. He knew where all the men were working on his shift, and so he had to go down another 200 feet into this area here, because men were working all over. Every bit of red there is a vein where people were working. And so there's no direct outset at this level to any other mine. And Sellow knew that unless he got the men down there, that they would all be killed. He first, on the 2,400 foot level, the one above it, he gathered the men in the complex tunneled areas there and led them out to the high ore, which is to the south. Every single time he went out, he went back in to rescue more people. He was the one that lit the fire. He knew most of all from anybody what he had started and what he needed to do to try to make amends. And you can just recreate his mindset of just first of terror and of guilt, and then of just this massive feeling that he was going to protect, he was going to save everybody he could until he himself died. And so that's the underlying tragedy that swept all these men into this situation as the carbon monoxide laden smoke gets poured through the entire system there unexpectedly for more than 400 men and probably another 1,000 men in the adjacent mines. So this is an area down about 200 feet lower, and you can see the complexity. It's incredibly difficult to figure out where you're going. The one place you can't go is that straight line that's going out toward the upper right diagonal. You have to try to go out through one of the lines that's going down to the right bottom corner. But to get there is incredibly difficult unless you know what you're doing. Then climbing up from there, you have to climb up from this 2,600 foot level. But these are the ladders. These are different levels. The horizontals are the different levels, and the vertical things that look like ladders are indeed ladders. They're manways that are used to go from level to level by climbing. The problem is that they're not continuous. You can go up one to the next level, and then you go to the side, and it may only go up partway. It may only go up 2 floors. And then what are you doing? You got the smoke is following you everywhere, and the smoke's filled with carbon monoxide that's so condensed that a couple of breaths and you'll be unconscious. And so the men were frantically trying to figure out where to go. There were only a few people who really knew how to maneuver and go through the different places in order to get out of the mine. This is the thing that was happening within the mine. The Granite Mountain shaft's on the right. Okay, and every mine has to breathe. The air has to go in so the men can work underground. It's a closed system otherwise. It's like being in outer space. You've got to generate air. And in this case, the air is generated. It's coming down the Granite Mountain shaft. And at June 8th, at 6,500 feet elevation, that's cold. It's at least freezing. So you got freezing downcast air coming down that shaft. The speculator mine is a natural upcast. It's part of where the out breath goes. Okay, but the fire's below everything in the Granite Mountain shaft, and so you got hot air filled with carbon monoxide and smoke coming up the shaft and capped off by the cold air coming down. And where does it go? It goes out into all the tunnels at every single level horizontally, and it goes across to the speculator shaft and then up the speculator shaft because that's where the out breath is going, the upcast. And what happens is at every level on the speculator side, the smoke then goes into the center. And so if you happen to be in the center, which is where at least 150 men were, you've got it coming from both sides. Okay, this is what the schematic looks like. It looks like there's just a straight line from one shaft to the other. But here's a rough map. This doesn't even show everything, but this is what it really looks like. So you're caught in this maze trying to maneuver sideways as well as up or down, and the shafts don't work. The speculator shaft was shut down to be re-timbered. They hadn't even put in the pull cords so that anybody at a station could call the hoist engineer to say, hey, I'm on the 2,200 foot level. And so they couldn't use any of the bell signals. And so the men had to try to get out themselves. Okay, two groups of men were trapped in different parts. One was kind of right in the center of the screen on the 2,400 foot level, and that's Manus Dugan. Here's a picture given to me by his grandson, who never met his grandfather. So this Manus Dugan was a nipper. He knew the whole area. A nipper carries the tools to all the different working groups in a given part of the mine. And so he was an inquisitive guy, and he knew all the interconnections. And so he told everybody, you realize they can't get out. They can't get to the speculator mine shaft. They cannot get to the Granite Mountain mine shaft. They can't get out to the Badger, which is to the north. And so he tells them, he says, you can all try to do that. You can try to put your muffler over your mouth and try to make it. But what I'm going to do, I think that's ill-advised. What I'm going to do is I'm going to bulkhead in. I said, you can follow me, or you can do what you want. And he convinced everybody to follow him into this one particular place called the 2471C crosscut. And so what they were trying to do is get into the dead ends where there's still oxygen. The smoke hadn't penetrated there, and then they would seal themselves off. And with the idea that hopefully the amount of oxygen left in their sealed off dead end tunnel would last long enough for the air to clear outside before they suffocated. That was what their choice was. So Dugan did this, and J.D. Moore did it in a place clear out on this other end, about 200 feet higher, exactly the same thing. They had to herd their men back into this place. It was the most contradictory sounding thing that you could ever imagine. How do you save yourself? By burying yourself. How do you do that? But these men had the presence of mind to do that because otherwise the men were just going to run straight into the dense smoke and carbon monoxide. Up above, these are the men who were trying to come back down to rescue anybody they could find. They had the most primitive rebreathers possible. They had about anywhere from a half hour, depending on the device, to 2 hours of an air supply. This photograph was given to me by by the granddaughter of the guy second from the right, Charles Huber, who was the head of the tramway rescue team. So these primitive rebreathers also have this kind of look to them. You can imagine trying to see out through foggy goggles in the midst of this murk. The mine foreman, Norman Braley, started pouring water down to limit the fire. And that, of course, produced this gigantic murk of smoke, smoldering, and carbon monoxide, and also started blowing up the superheated shaft in place. But this is the kind of look that people would have. And if you recall, or if you remember that these carbon monoxide symptoms are paranoia and disturbance and perception and dizziness, whatnot. You can imagine if you're a man half conscious looking out and through the murk comes this creature. Is it a rescuer or is it a demon come to steal your soul? And there are numerous examples of men basically going nuts, as they were confronted with that circumstance. They couldn't be convinced that this creature was somebody who came to help them. And despite all that, the men by the hundreds went down and organized teams very quickly to try to find any survivors. By the next morning, it was just beginning to dawn on people what the horror that was going on underground. So you have this kind of thing. You can see the two squares here. There's Moore's bulkheads on the 2200 and 200 feet below it, and about 1,000 feet to the east was Dugan's bulkhead. Dugan had 28 men behind it, and Moore had 10. And they're in a race against time, against suffocation, and the clearing of the mine gas. So no one knew that these people were down there, sealed off. No one knew that. It was a whole detective study in motion, knowing that the clock was ticking and the late hours were coming, that if anyone was left, that they were on the verge of death. Dugan wrote in his notebook to his wife that Sunday 1 a.m., so this is 24 hours later, I realize all the oxygen is being consumed. Everybody is breathing heavily. If death comes, it'll be caused by all the oxygen being used in the chamber. Dugan. Another man, Murdy Shea, wrote, there's no water to drink, there's nothing to eat, the air's foul. The carbide lamps and the candles, they won't light. My matches won't light, and they're good matches. Men are getting desperate. They want to burn up the bulkhead and commit suicide trying to escape. They can't stand the suffering. We've rapped on the pipe and made out that someone was coming to give us hope. We're trying, but we rapped 1,000,000 times and it's all fake. No one will ever show. On the other side, where Moore was, and of course these men didn't know that there was another team, Moore was doing everything he could to keep his men's spirits up. He was feeding and he was helping them with water, just even wetting their lips. Total darkness, the lights are completely out. He wrote to his wife, Dear Pet, this may be the last message you'll get from me. The gas broke about 11:15. I tried to get the men out, but the smoke was too strong. I got some of the boys with me in a drift. We put in a bulkhead. By 5 a.m., he wrote again. He said, Dear Pet, there's a young fellow here, Clarence Martha. He has a wife and 2 kiddies. Tell her we did the best we could. The cards were against us. By 7 a.m., the air was going bad. They must have had the carbon monoxide coming into the chamber as they were building the bulkhead. Said, Dear Pet, we're waiting for the end. I guess it won't be long. We take turns rapping on the pipe, so if the rescue crew is around, they'll hear us. Try not to worry. I know you will, but trust in God. Everything will come out right. We will meet again. With love to my pet, and may God take care of you. They were asleep or comatose much of the time. the rescuers came and actually knocked on the bulkheads, but the men were out and they didn't answer. And the men outside did not know that the men inside were there. And they couldn't at that point break down the bulkheads or they would have killed everybody. So inside, the men are starting to suffocate. They're getting right to the edge of life and death. In Dugan's bulkhead, twice there were mutinies where men tried to break down the bulkhead, and he stopped them with a calm voice, explaining, telling them, convincing them to sit and wait. After a day and a half on Sunday afternoon, Dugan pulled out a shirt that was sticking in a hole in the bulkhead, and he kept smelling it over that time to see if the gas outside was lessening. And finally, at about 12 o'clock on Sunday morning, of 1 o'clock, he could determine that it was getting clear outside. And he whispered to the men sitting beside him at the bulkhead, said, "Are you ready to take the gambler's chance? Now's the time." They broke down the bulkhead, and the air from outside still had carbon monoxide and it still had smoke, but it was relatively fresh. And if they could smell life, it had come down from them for thousands of feet through the tunnels. They could feel from the thick, blurred dreams of the dead, they could feel life as it existed far above them. And hope rose again. One man stood there, and as the cool, fresh air rolled over him, he took a deep breath and said, "My God, air." Dugan was in the lead. He was the only one that knew the place. He came out of the bulkhead and went all the way to the speculator shaft in total darkness. And there he leaned into the shaft and he couldn't find the pull cord, so he couldn't call the hoist engineer. And so he turned around and went back out a different way, determined to save his men. And he started out, and you can see in the map, he goes back and retraces his step, goes out through this ventilation shaft on the right, and he up to this manway, and he's going to climb about 400 feet upwards and then go far out to this place called the Rainbow Mine, where somebody was always on the hoist. Meanwhile, the men crawled on hands and knees. The other men came out of the bulkhead and crawled on hands and knees to the station. And they didn't know any other way. They didn't know, and they couldn't call. They couldn't find the pull cord. And finally, one of them, who's what's called a rope man, said it might be hanging in the shaft. And so two of them held on to the other, one of the third, and who leaned into the open shaft in pitch blackness with more than 1,000 feet of open air below him. And he reached around trying to see if something was hanging from above, some rope. And on the third big swing, he found a cord. He pulled it in and he carefully counted out 9 bells, pulled the cord 9 times, which rings the bell by the hoist engineer thousands of feet above him on the surface. 9 bells is the signal for universal danger there. And then he rang in the code 6 pause 4, which was the 2,400 foot level. And the hoist engineer up above heard this. He'd been putting people, rescuers, for all the levels above that, but he knew that there was nobody on the 2,400 level. And so when he heard the 9 bells, he knew immediately there was some problem. And he thought, my God, what's going on? Where are these? What do I need to do? And then he heard the levels 6 and 4, and he knew there was no one there. And he thought he'd misheard it. And then 9 bells came again, 6 and 4. And he knew they were survivors. So they sent down men who came off the cages under their light and their carbide lanterns, about 8 naked men with more crawling toward them down the tunnels, blinking at the first light they'd seen for 48 hours. So when they were raised to the surface, the men came out, and the crowd was all around the speculator, rejoicing, slapping backs, hugging each other, saying, my God, it's a miracle, it's a miracle. And then they realized that Dugan wasn't with them. The man who'd saved them was gone. They quickly went to try to figure out where he had gone. So they focused on this one area far out to the east, where there was a manway and this little kind of floret of tunnels. They looked and looked and couldn't find anything. And then two days later, they found his body about 150 feet up one of the manways, leaning against the ladder. And they identified it with the last of the notebook with his notes to his wife. They identified it with this particular note. So to my wife and to my mother, dearest, it breaks my heart to be taken from you so suddenly and unexpectedly, but think not of me, for if death comes, it'll be in a sleep without suffering. I ask you for forgiveness for any pain or suffering I've ever caused. Madge, which is Dugan's wife, Madge, the house is for you and the child. Manus. The same kind of thing played out on the other side with Moore's men, except they were in for much longer. There was a whole detective investigation by a guy named Tom Lamartine, who was one of the most revered rescuers, who on every single major mine disaster in Butte. And this is his route coming down for 2 days. He went back 3 different times and found the bulkhead and rapped on it where more people were behind it, but there was no answer. They were all comatose. And the third time or fourth time he went down, he had been thinking about this, knowing that time was of the essence. Almost there's no way that people could last this long. And he convinced himself to take an axe down, and he convinced the mine manager that there was a bulkhead built there after the fire had started, and they must check it out. He had reported it each of the times he'd been down there, and in the frenzy and the chaos, nobody had ever checked it. And when they went down, he took his axe and he swung it and he peeled off a board. And from inside, there was a voice, a clear voice that said, "Hello out there." They stripped down the bulkhead and they found 3 men dying right on the threshold of the bulkhead and other men behind them. And they got a rescue team and they pulled them out. Lamartine carried a man up that he thought was Moore, or thought was Mike Sullivan, who was still alive. And but 3 of the men died as they were taking them out and rescuing them. This is the headline on Monday. Fire started on Friday night. By Monday, they'd found the last of the men. So Moore's men were opened up. The bulkhead was opened up when Moore's men were right at the point where they were crossing the dividing line between life and death. And to me, it's very much like the fall here. I know all of you know this, where there's been 2, 3, 4 really hard frosts, and suddenly the Norway maples and all the other trees are turning this brilliant, brilliant color. And then they reach a place where one day, when there's this extra frost, the leaves just effortlessly fall away from the tree and float away into the air and down onto the ground. And the men were exactly like those leaves. They were so close to death. They were falling over the edge and dropping away from life, even as John, Lissa, and the others were talking to Tom Lamartine through the wall, and he was opening it up. Right at that moment, they were falling away from life. So Lamartine and the other men rescued 6 of Moore's 10 men, but 4 of them, including Moore, died during the rescue. There's just a limit to what men can endure. So 168 men died in that disaster, but 240 men in the mine lived. And this is what men do when they're thrust into life and death situations that strip that all of everything they are right down to the core. You see everything that people can be. And so to me, this is not a mining story. It's a story about the deepest part of the human spirit. It's a story about all of us as well, about what we are and what we might be. And when you reach the limits of human strength, the question is, what is left? And the truth is that people rise up no matter what the odds, and they'll do what's needed. And the epitaph on Dugan's headstone was this: "No greater love hath a man than to lay down his life for a friend." And it's a truth, I believe, that the greatest things we're capable of come from the greatest sacrifice. And I personally find that a profound beauty and an inspiration that goes right along with the heartache and the sadness. And to me, it's as true today as it was then in the tunnels of the speculator, and it always will be true. Because the story shows that when everything that sustains us is gone, the water, the light, and even the air we need to breathe, that the darkness will still be lit by heroes. I'd like you to say goodbye to the men of the speculator. Please watch this slide. Look at the men's faces. This is a different shift and a different mind, but they're all brothers. They're all brothers in arms. So look at the men as the time fades from that past to the present. And the men turn to ghosts, and the Butte minds are quiet. Thank you very much. Any questions you have, I'll be happy to answer. I know that's a difficult thing on a Wednesday morning at 8:30 in the morning, but some stories, some acts don't wait for any of us to be ready.
Good job.
Okay, are there any questions or comments?
Thanks, Doug. That was really well done. Very interesting. Thank you.
You're welcome. Yeah, it was a labor of love, I have to say. Probably the most complex story I ever tried to write. I mean, I have a career in scientific editing, dealing with extremely complex research, with many multiple branches and so forth. But making sense out of this was the hardest thing I've ever done. I mean, technically, intellectually, but also emotionally. You get where big pieces of the story started fitting together because nobody ever knew really what happened. There were just hand-waving tales. Nobody ever had the maps. Nobody ever had the eyewitness reports from the men who were with the people where all these things happened. And so I just got pulled into this thing because I almost had no choice. It's like this story has to be told. It will never be told again because all the men who ever worked under the hill, this unique place, will be dead. They're all in their late 80s and early 90s now. Fortunately, many of them still are completely just sharp as tack and very interested in their history. And so this was my deep dive into it. I have a parallel presentation that I did for all the technical stuff that I had to figure out in order to be able to tell the human side of this. So there's a whole nother book that I'll try to finish just on the science of the disaster. Because what this was basically, if you know the term systems collapse is basically applied to things like Chernobyl or 3 Mile Island or the collapse of a navigation system for an airliner. They're automated systems, algorithmically set to deal within certain parameters. But the incredible thing with this is that there's no automation. It's all humans at every single point making a decision based on their experience and their assessment at the time. So it is probably the first full-on systems collapse ever in history. Because of the nature of this being a mine separated from the surface and having to be a self-contained system where all these different parts all work together. And despite the fact that the very best mine engineers, best ventilation engineers, the best electrical and mechanical engineers all designed the system, there are flaws that people cannot see. And when the circumstances happen, and something happens that was unforeseen and even unthinkable, like the fire, the cable used to create the fire prevention system actually itself starts on fire and way down in the main shaft. When something like that happens, all bets are off. And so I have a separate separate book on that. It's just technical, fascinating technical stuff that underlies all the human drama.
Any other comments or questions? I can't see lots of you, so just go ahead and unmute. Oh. Yeah, we can hear you.
Hey,
I totally agree. That I made a comment at the beginning, before the presentation started, just how well Butte and especially their archives works with the older people. They'll take in the community, they'll take photographs. They have literally 100,000 photographs that taken in Butte all over the place. They're incredibly good photographs, and they'll take them around to the nursing homes and have people just free associate to them. It's amazing what people will remember when they are provoked in that way, as well as feeling really good because they're contributing to the community. They're contributing their stories to part of this whole culture. And that's something about Butte that's really exceptional. And if something like Missoula could be done, it would like that. It would really, really, I think, both improve people's lives, be able to help tell their stories and the richness of the past. I have another presentation thing I've been working on for about the last 2.5 or 3 years, just retaking old historical photographs from precisely the same place they were taken, and basically making time-lapse videos of them. And so I've shown this in a couple places. Montana Historical Society has asked me to give a special presentation on it at their conference. But what it does is that you suddenly realize how vibrant, how rich, how fascinating life was, say, in 1880 or 1890. Suddenly you realize that our streets in downtown Missoula are in many ways completely uninteresting compared to the richness that they had. So there are things like this that will completely change a modern person's perspective about what life was like and how busy and vibrant it was.
Go back.
So, I mean, I'm full up in all the different kinds of things I'm trying to do, but it would really be nice if, Mansfield Center or somebody like that could actually create or push for a position that actively did this with interaction directly with the community. I think it's what you have in Butte is that everybody's at least an amateur historian, right? And so what you get are people who feel like they can contribute. And I think that's one thing that having, professional designations works against. It's like, oh, I'm not a historian, so I don't have anything to add. Well, that's not true. And so I think that, a more open policy would be far superior. I mean, you just be amazed at what people remember and what they did. Just astonishing. So I do that every place I go now. I mean, this is like my 4th career as a historian of some sort. But the fact of the matter is that if you're empathetic to the people and you're super interested in seeing what they think and what they're like, and you make a place for them, you respect them, you open up history in a way that is impossible from looking at specific documents. What you get is the lived experience. So rich, really is what people do and why they act the way they do. You can look up, members of the Elks Club, Benevolent and Protective Order of the Elks or the Ancient Hibernians, and you get a certain view, but it's only an official view. You can count your beans, you can count your specifics, who did what and how much they've donated and whatnot, but you don't get the lived experience, which is where people are, who they are. So that lived experience, and so this is something, coming from a psychological background, that basically I find in this historical stuff that I can use everything I ever learned. I can use the physics, as you heard some in this, to understand my geology, to understand, because people act, in ways that are not contained in the bean counting there. That's not life. It's only a kind of thin, sterile number that's left after the life. And so, I would just highly recommend anybody who's got any pull anywhere to encourage this lived experience, recording the lived experience.
This is Ken Egan. I was just going to comment, Doug, great presentation, but that's exactly what the new certificate in public history is about at the University of Montana. So they're training these students to go forward and do those kind of oral narratives. So I just wanted to do a shout out to UM, but also just thank you for a great talk. So.
Oh, well, thanks. I mean, that's very good to hear. It has to be kind of a groundswell. And it's not just students, but it has to encompass the community themselves so that they feel like they have a say. That's just what I see in Butte. It never would have occurred to me, except, I'm always interested in individuals, and, so I'm always interested in listening. But, it's a different thing to scale that into a program, right? As I'm sure you know. But it's an attitude, it's like it's an open arms attitude toward people that they do have something to contribute. Then it's up to the historian or the storyteller. This is an incredible story, and I pulled out all the stops to try to figure out all the different odds and ends, and it's 100 times as complex as anything I could ever extend. But at a certain point, you have to identify themes that are the core to everything, or at least to most things, because otherwise you just have this sprawl, the infinite sprawl of life, instead of a story.
Thank you very much. That was a great presentation, very interesting. And we appreciate your being here.